Hello, my dear friends. If you think not having a refrigerator is simply a lack of storage space, you haven't lived in the Victorian era, where every meal could be a gut murder, from pretending to be safe salt shakers to disguised stews of food that were about to spoil. People in the past didn't eat because they wanted to, but because they wanted to survive. But what's even more strange is that these seemingly gruesome preservation methods were tied to love, marriage, and even trust and intuition. Tonight, let us quietly follow the forgotten survival rituals before refrigeration took over the world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to enter a Victorian kitchen, the first thing that might strike the senses would not be the sight of polished pans or neat shelves, but the uncertainty that lingered over every meal. There was no refrigerator humming in the corner, no icebox waiting with steady cold. Preservation was a fragile practice held together by trust in the season, the temperature, and the luck of the household. Winter offered a form of relief, the natural chill slowing down decay. Summer, however, was something different. Heat turned meat, milk, and bread into problems that could not always be solved. Families lived with the knowledge that each day, food might spoil before it reached the table. This dependence on weather meant that people grew cautious, though caution did not always equal safety. Meat purchased in the morning could look fine, only to sour before evening if the air grew warm. Bread hardened quickly, vegetables shriveled, and milk curdled with alarming speed. The poor accepted this as ordinary. They bought food in small amounts, ate quickly, and hoped for the best. Wealthier homes had cellars or cool pantries, but even these spaces could not compete with the steady protection of refrigeration. What existed was improvisation, and improvisation was fragile. The sight of a family meal in a modest home often carried this fragility. A loaf placed on the table might already be edged with staleness. A jug of milk poured into cups might carry a faint sour smell. Children grew used to the taste of food that was not entirely fresh. Illness was common, and people rarely connected it directly to what they ate. In crowded streets where sewage flowed in gutters and air thickened with smoke, food was just one of many hazards. A bad stomach was not unusual, and death from foodborne illness was folded into the background of daily life. Markets reflected the same uncertainty. Stalls lined with meat gave off smells that today would drive buyers away instantly. Cuts were hung in the open air, flies moving freely, dust clinging to the flesh. Vegetables were stacked high, but many were soft, spotted, or already turning. Bread, displayed without a cover, gathered soot from nearby chimneys. Still, customers came. They bought what they could afford and carried it home quickly, knowing that every hour of delay made the risk higher. The market was not about freshness as modern minds understand it. It was about access, price, and speed. Households developed habits to stretch the life of food for as long as possible. Bread was toasted to hide its dryness. Sour milk was used in baking to mask its curdling. Meat was cut into smaller pieces and stewed, the heat and spices concealing flavours that might otherwise betray its state. These practices did not remove danger, but they allowed families to manage appearances and avoid waste. Waste was something few could afford. Every coin spent had to provide nourishment, even if that nourishment carried hidden costs. Trust played a role in every decision. Families trusted their senses to guide them: a quick sniff, a glance at colour, a test with the tongue. If food seemed acceptable, it was eaten. The margin for error was slim. Many learned by bitter experience that what seemed safe could turn suddenly cruel. Food poisoning left bodies weak, racked with cramps, or worse. Yet families rarely questioned the system itself. They blamed fate, poor luck, or personal weakness. The idea that food should be inherently safe had not yet taken hold. The wealthy attempted greater control. They built storage rooms underground, thick-walled and dark, where the air stayed cooler. Servants carried food down each day, arranging it on shelves in hopes that the absence of light and warmth would slow decay. Some families purchased imported ice, stored in large blocks for weeks at a time. But these luxuries were far from common. The majority of people lived without them, relying instead on instinct, weather, and prayer. Food was not guaranteed to last. Each meal was a negotiation with time. The absence of reliable preservation shaped the rhythm of daily life. Shopping was done almost every day, sometimes twice, because holding food longer invited danger. Meals were planned around what could be finished quickly. Families adjusted their eating to the pace of spoilage. There was little thought of storing leftovers, because leftovers were tomorrow's hazard. This cycle consumed time and energy, binding people to routines that we might now find exhausting. Illness hovered in the background of these choices. Doctors noted frequent digestive troubles among the working classes. Children were especially vulnerable, their bodies too small to endure repeated bouts of sickness. Deaths from spoiled food were rarely recorded as such. Instead, they blended into the general statistics of disease, lost in the sea of cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. Yet behind many of those numbers was a household meal that had gone bad before it was eaten. What is striking in hindsight is the level of acceptance. People did not consider their food safe, yet they accepted the risks as natural. Complaints were rare, reforms slower still. The connection between preservation and health was not fully recognised, and without refrigeration or regulation, there was little that could be done. Trust in instinct, trust in luck, and trust in nature remained the only defences. To imagine this world is to imagine a society where every bite carries a quiet gamble. The bread might be fine, the milk might be safe, the meat might still be edible, or it might not. The line between nourishment and poison was crossed often, but quietly, folded into the normal rhythm of life. Victorian families did not ask whether their food was safe. They asked only whether it was there, whether it was affordable, and whether it looked acceptable enough to eat. People depended on cold weather and quick meals to keep danger at bay, yet sickness never stopped haunting their tables. In time, other strategies were invented to make food last longer, using ingredients that seemed protective but came with heavy costs. One of those strategies filled kitchens with salt until meals became something barely recognisable as food. Salt in Victorian society was never just a pinch sprinkled across a plate. It was the foundation of food preservation, the tool that made it possible for families to keep food longer than a single day in a world without refrigeration. Meat and fish were not stored for beauty or taste, but for endurance, and salt was the only weapon sharp enough to fight decay. Cuts of beef or pork were packed into barrels, pressed under layers of coarse white crystals until they became stiff and pale. Fish lost their shimmer, their skins dulled to a chalky surface, their flesh hardened. What emerged from this process no longer looked fresh, yet it could last weeks or even months. In homes without ice, that was as good as safety itself. In the markets of Victorian towns, this practice was on full display. Butchers leaned over boards stained with brine, their knives cutting slabs of salted beef. Fishmongers plunged their arms into barrels filled with wet, slick herring, their sleeves soaked in salty water. The smell was pungent and unrelenting, a mix of salt, fat, and the faint sourness of meat that had sat too long. Buyers pushed forward anyway. They knew fresh meat spoiled quickly. They knew a loaf of bread could harden in hours. Salt was not pleasant, but it was trustworthy. In a marketplace where everything carried a risk, salt was a currency of reassurance. For working families, Salted food became a routine so common that its harshness faded into expectation. Fish steeped in brine were pulled from hooks, soaked overnight in bowls of water, and then boiled with cabbage or potatoes. The salt never fully disappeared. Mouths burned, tongues ached, and thirst drove people to drink endlessly after meals. Still, children learned to associate this taste with home. Salted meat was food, and food was survival. Complaints rarely mattered when the alternative was an empty stomach. Inside the homes of the wealthy, salt ruled with more order but with the same necessity. Servants layered pork in stone jars, pouring salt into every gap, watching carefully for dampness. They hauled heavy barrels into cellars where the air grew so thick with saline that breathing became uncomfortable. The sharpness clung to the walls, a constant reminder of the wealth that allowed a family to plan weeks ahead. In these grand houses, salted food was less about day-to-day need and more about preparedness, but the reliance was just as absolute. Even those who had more could not escape the limits of preservation technology. Over time, salt shaped taste itself. Recipes no longer began with fresh meat. They began with salted pork or beef, and cooks layered flavours on top of the bitterness. Stews bubbled for hours, heavy with onions and herbs, all in an effort to cover the sting. Bread was dipped into salty broths to soften the blow. Vegetables were chopped and boiled alongside, not to bring freshness, but to share in the brine and carry its burden. What was once considered harsh became normal, and what was normal became culture. People did not expect food to taste otherwise. The consequences on the body were real but rarely acknowledged. High salt intake left people perpetually thirsty, and fatigue crept into daily life. But slow harm did not frighten Victorians. They were surrounded by dangers far more immediate: cholera in the water, smoke in the air, accidents in factories. Compared to these, the strain of salt seemed insignificant. Parents were grateful to feed their children meals that did not make them collapse within hours. Long-term suffering was invisible, and invisibility was enough for acceptance. Vegetables received the same treatment as meat and fish. Cucumbers, cabbage, and roots were pressed into brine for storage. When pulled out, their texture was rough, their taste biting, but they survived the months when no fresh greens were available. Families endured their sourness because choice did not exist. Preservation mattered more than pleasure, and in many homes, jars of pickled vegetables lined shelves as proof that hunger could be kept at bay a little longer. Street life reinforced salt's importance. Vendors cried out offers of salted pork or fish, their voices rising above the din of horses and carts. Buckets of brine splashed onto the cobblestones as portions were scooped out, the liquid mingling with dirt and ash. Passers-by wrinkled their noses but reached into their pockets anyway. No household could afford to reject salt. It preserved not just food but the fragile illusion of security. That illusion, though thin, was worth every coin. To imagine this from a modern perspective is unsettling. Supermarkets today overflow with fresh produce, bright cuts of meat, and packaged meals. The idea that every option could be drowned in salt, every flavour smothered, feels unbearable. Yet for Victorians, it was the rhythm of life. Salt did not symbolise deprivation but control, a rare form of certainty in a world that offered little. In hindsight, salt emerges as both saviour and oppressor. It carried people through seasons, but it also weighed heavily on their meals. It extended food's life but shortened the pleasure of eating. Still, families clung to it, because to do otherwise would have been unthinkable. Salt was not a choice. Salt was survival. Salt protected families while leaving them thirsty and weary, shaping a diet that felt secure but monotonous. It could not be the only answer, and people searched for ways to preserve food while giving it something more. That search turned their attention to smoke, where fires promised both protection and flavour. Smoke offered not only endurance but also a taste that clung to the flesh, dark and unforgettable. Salt preserved life while robbing food of freshness, forcing households to rely on its sting. In time, other methods would rise, seeking to balance safety with taste. Among them was the smoky haze that wrapped meat in both security and mystery, leaving behind a preservation method that felt as haunting as it was necessary. Smoking food in Victorian times was not a luxury or a matter of refined taste, it was a survival strategy. Families who owned little more than a hearth and a hook learned to suspend their cuts of meat above slow fires, letting smoke seep into the flesh until it hardened and darkened. The process was not delicate, nor was it clean. Ash clung to the meat, soot drifted through kitchens, and the smell of smoke lingered in hair and clothes long after the fire was out. Yet to those who depended on it, smoke meant safety. It slowed decay, kept flies at bay, and made food last long enough to feed families who could not afford to replace it each day. Markets in Victorian towns often smelled of smoke before one even reached the stalls. Rows of hanging hams, their surfaces stained a deep brown, dangled in doorways. Fish, once pale and fragile, were transformed into rigid strips of smoky flesh stacked in bundles. Vendors took pride in displaying these goods, pointing to their colour and scent as proof of quality. Buyers understood that a smoked product could be trusted longer than a fresh one, and in a world where trust in food was fragile, that meant everything. In working-class homes, smoking was as practical as it was economical. Families hung meat above open hearths, letting the smoke curl upward to do its work. The cuts often stayed there for days, absorbing not just the flavour of the fire but also the dirt of the household air. Children slept in rooms that smelled perpetually of wood and char. Meals prepared from this food carried the unmistakable taste of fire, sharp and sometimes bitter, but comforting in its promise of durability. To them, the smoky bite was not a luxury. It was survival disguised as flavour. For wealthier families, the process looked more deliberate. Purpose-built smokehouses stood behind country estates or large townhouses, small dark buildings where fires smouldered under careful watch. Servants tended the fires, ensuring that the smoke rose steadily, coating rows of hams and sausages hanging above. The results were stored in pantries, their surfaces glossy with resin from hours of exposure. The wealthy treated these foods as symbols of abundance, proud of their ability to stockpile. Yet beneath the refinement lay the same need to keep food from spoiling in a world without refrigeration. Smoking altered not only preservation but also diet. Recipes adjusted to accommodate the flavour, folding smoky meats into stews, pies, and broths. The distinct taste became expected, even celebrated, turning necessity into tradition. Some people craved it, praising the sharp edge that reminded them of firesides and home. Others endured it, finding the bitterness heavy but tolerable compared to the dangers of eating spoiled flesh. Either way, smoke entered the palate of Victorian life as firmly as salt had before it. The process itself was not without hazards. Soot clung to meat, sometimes leaving behind gritty layers that could not be fully washed away. Poor families who smoked food indoors lived with air thickened by smoke, their lungs filling with particles day after day. Coughing and shortness of breath were common companions to preservation. Yet such risks were accepted. In a city choked by factory chimneys and coal fires, a smoky kitchen seemed almost ordinary. In villages and rural towns, smoking took on communal forms. Whole sides of pork were hung in barns, the smoke from slow fires drifting upward to coat them. Neighbours sometimes shared space in larger smokehouses, pooling resources to make the work more efficient. The shared scent of burning wood bound communities together, a reminder of the collective need to outlast the threats of decay. Smoked food could be stored, transported, and traded more easily than fresh meat, extending its reach into markets miles away. Children grew accustomed to the permanence of the smell. Their clothes reeked of smoke, their hands stained from handling darkened cuts of meat. Some grew to love it, associating it with warmth and security. Others disliked the taste but swallowed it anyway, their protests silenced by hunger. For both groups, smoke became part of daily memory, woven into the fabric of life as deeply as the soot that clung to city walls. Comparing this practice to modern times highlights its severity. Today, smoked foods are considered delicacies, chosen for taste rather than survival. In Victorian streets, there was no such luxury. Smoking was not about adding depth of flavour for enjoyment. It was about avoiding the terror of waking to find a family's only supply of meat spoiled overnight. To rely on smoke was to accept its bitterness in exchange for life. Doctors occasionally raised concerns about smoked foods, noting the heaviness they placed on digestion and the possible harms of soot. But these voices were faint. The greater threat remained spoiled food, and no one could ignore the immediacy of that danger. In homes where children had already been lost to illness, smoked meat was a comfort, not a worry. It was proof that something could be trusted to last beyond a single day. The persistence of smoking also revealed a Victorian contradiction. A society that prized morality and progress lived with kitchens filled with soot and fire. The same people who spoke of order and cleanliness tolerated meals darkened by smoke. But appearances mattered less than survival, and survival was the standard by which choices were judged. In that context, the smoky haze was not a flaw, but a shield. Smoking gave families another layer of protection against hunger, though it left a permanent mark on both their health and their taste. It stretched food across weeks, shaped traditions, and offered a sense of stability. Yet even this method could not stand alone. Smoke, like salt, was imperfect, and Victorians sought more ways to guard their meals. Among those, sweetness emerged as an unexpected ally. Sugar, costly but effective, offered a preservation method that promised both safety and pleasure, though its consequences would soon prove costly in other ways. Smoking turned kitchens into places of soot and fire, altering both food and health while keeping hunger at a distance. People accepted its bitterness because safety mattered more than comfort. What came next was a preservation method that looked harmless and delightful, yet carried risks hidden behind the sweetness of sugar. Sugar in Victorian times carried an image of luxury, but it also became one of the most widespread methods for keeping food from spoiling. Families who could afford even small amounts used it not only for sweetness, but for its preserving power. Fruit, which would normally rot within days, could be boiled in sugar until it transformed into something hard, sticky, and unrecognizable. Jars of jam and candied fruit lined kitchen shelves, their glossy surfaces catching the dim light. These jars were more than treats. They were tools of survival disguised as indulgence. Markets reflected this duality. Stalls displayed rows of jams sealed with wax, and baskets held dried, sugared fruits. Vendors praised their longevity, promising that fruit preserved in this way could last through the year. The bright colours were appealing, standing out in contrast to the dull browns of salted and smoked foods. Buyers felt reassured. Sugar was costly, but it promised both safety and pleasure. Two things that rarely went together in the Victorian diet. Families saved coins to buy a jar, convinced that it was worth the sacrifice. Inside working-class homes, sugar was used sparingly. A single jar of jam might last weeks, its contents rationed carefully. Mothers spread thin layers on bread to stretch it further, each spoonful a gesture of both love and caution. Children waited eagerly for these moments, the sweetness breaking the monotony of salty or smoky meals. They did not realize that the sugar itself carried its own risks. Rotten teeth, bleeding gums, and constant pain followed heavy use. But in the short term, the presence of sugar meant joy. In wealthier households, sugar took on a grander role. Kitchens filled with copper pans boiled fruits in heavy syrup, the steam clinging to walls. Servants poured the mixture into glass jars, sealing them with wax or paper. These families could afford abundance, stacking their shelves with preserves that lasted through winter. At the dining table, sugared fruits were served as desserts, offered with pride to guests. Sweetness was more than flavour, it was a symbol of refinement. Yet the purpose was still the same: to extend the life of food beyond its natural limits. Sugar altered not just preservation, but also expectation. Once families knew they could keep fruit year-round, they wanted it. Recipes multiplied, calling for jams, candied peels, and syrups. Children grew accustomed to the sweetness that lingered even in months when no fresh fruit could be found. The taste of sugar became ingrained in the culture, blurring the line between necessity and indulgence. What had started as a method of survival became a habit that reshaped diets permanently. Doctors began to notice the toll. Dental problems became widespread, especially among children. Reports described teeth blackened and crumbling, gums bleeding with every bite. Pain was constant, and yet families continued to boil fruit in sugar. The immediate benefit of preservation overshadowed the slower destruction of health. Few connected the dots between jars of jam and the agony of a toothache. In a time when many died young from disease, the idea that sugar might also be dangerous was easily ignored. In poorer neighbourhoods, counterfeiters also entered the trade. To cut costs, some sellers mixed sugar with cheaper substances, creating jams that looked bright but carried grit or bitterness. Families bought them anyway, preferring the illusion of sweetness to none at all. It was another reminder that even in pleasure, risk lingered. The safety of sugar was never complete. Compared to salt or smoke, sugar carried a deceptive charm. It seemed harmless, even joyful. It brightened meals and gave the impression of cleanliness. Children licked spoons coated in syrup, unaware that they were eating future pain. Adults welcomed the variety, grateful to have an alternative to harsh or bitter preservation methods. Yet beneath the surface, sugar worked its own damage, turning smiles into grimaces and leaving lasting scars on health. The process itself was laborious. Fruit had to be cleaned, boiled, stirred constantly to avoid burning, and sealed quickly before contamination could set in. Kitchens grew hot, the air thick with the scent of cooked fruit and syrup. Sticky residue clung to counters and pans, attracting insects. Still, families endured the work because the result was security. A jar of preserves on a shelf meant food that could be trusted months later. In uncertain times, that was worth the effort. The presence of sugar in Victorian kitchens also revealed the inequalities of the era. While wealthier families could store dozens of jars, poorer ones relied on small amounts or none at all. For the poor, sweetness was rare and precious, a fleeting escape from hardship. For the rich, it was abundant, even wasteful at times. The contrast highlighted how preservation itself was shaped by class, with sugar standing as both a practical tool and a marker of privilege. Looking back, sugar's role in preservation shows another contradiction of Victorian life. A society obsessed with order and morality embraced a substance that damaged health while keeping food safe. Appearances mattered more than consequences. Families displayed jars of gleaming jam proudly, never acknowledging the hidden costs. To them, sugar was progress, proof that human ingenuity could fight against decay. That it carried its own dangers was a truth too easily overlooked. The culture of sugar preserved not just food, but also illusions. It preserved the illusion of abundance, of pleasure, of control over nature's limits. It turned fruit into something lasting, but it also turned mouths into sites of pain. Still, families clung to it, because the alternative was scarcity. They chose sweetness with suffering over bitterness with safety. In doing so, they left behind a legacy that still echoes in modern diets. Sugar provided joy and danger in equal measure, protecting fruit while quietly harming those who consumed it. It represented both progress and contradiction, a preservation method that seemed innocent but carried invisible costs. Families accepted it because they had little choice, and once accepted, it became tradition. But sugar, like salt and smoke, was only one piece of the puzzle. Other methods would rise, harsher and sharper, offering preservation through sourness rather than sweetness, and reshaping the very meaning of taste. Sugar stretched fruit across seasons, keeping shelves bright and meals varied, even as it left mouths aching and bodies weary. Families embraced it for its promise of safety, but beneath the promise lay pain. What came after sugar was a preservative that stripped sweetness away entirely, replacing it with acid so sharp it could wake the senses and sting the tongue. Vinegar in the Victorian era was not treated as a gentle condiment. It was sharp, unforgiving, and often poured over food with more force than care. Families without reliable preservation turned to vinegar because its acid could cut through rot, disguise unpleasant odours, and give the illusion of safety. Cucumbers, radishes, onions, and cabbage were submerged in it, transforming from tender vegetables into biting, sour fragments that stung the tongue. The taste was shocking but effective, convincing people that what they ate was not spoiled but simply strong. In kitchens where freshness rarely lasted, vinegar was the quick fix that promised salvation. Markets carried the smell of vinegar long before customers reached the stalls. Large jars sat in rows, their contents bobbing in cloudy liquid. Vendors scooped out pickled vegetables with stained ladles, dripping brine onto the ground. The scent mixed with the odours of fish, meat, and smoke, creating a marketplace atmosphere that was both overwhelming and familiar. Buyers accepted this without hesitation. A pickle that lasted months was more trustworthy than a vegetable that softened in days. The bite of vinegar reassured them, telling them the food was safe enough to swallow. In working-class homes, pickling was a seasonal ritual. Families gathered vegetables at harvest, washed them roughly, and stuffed them into jars with vinegar and spices if they could afford them. The liquid hissed against the vegetables, turning them sour within days. These jars lined shelves through the winter, offering something to chew when no fresh produce remained. Meals of bread and broth were made livelier by the sharp crunch of pickles. Children winced at the sting, their faces puckering, yet they reached for more because vinegar meant food that had survived. Wealthier families handled vinegar with more refinement. Their kitchens produced elegant pickles flavoured with cloves, mustard seeds, or dill, prepared by servants who followed recipes copied from cookbooks. Glass jars sealed with wax were stored in pantries, brought out during meals as delicacies. Guests might enjoy pickled walnuts or spiced cucumbers as side dishes, praising their flavour. But beneath the refinement, the principle was the same. Vinegar was still protection, a shield against the relentless decay that threatened all food. The taste of vinegar marked diets as much as salt or smoke. It shocked the mouth, cutting through the heaviness of salted meat and the bitterness of smoke. For many, it became not just a preservative but a flavour they expected. Meals without a sour edge felt incomplete. Families came to rely on vinegar not just for safety but for familiarity. The sting was unpleasant at times, but it also became comforting. Health concerns were rarely discussed. People believed vinegar cleansed the body, even describing pickles as ways to purify themselves. Doctors occasionally warned about its harsh effects on digestion, but those voices were faint. In an age when cholera and typhoid swept through neighbourhoods, vinegar seemed harmless in comparison. If anything, its sharpness was believed to cut through sickness rather than cause it. Families swallowed it with confidence, choosing to see it as medicine as much as food. The process itself was messy. Vegetables were packed tightly, liquid spilling across counters and soaking into wood. The smell filled homes, clinging to walls and clothing. Once opened, jars often carried a layer of mould on top, which was scraped away without hesitation. The remaining food was eaten with pride. Mould was not seen as a warning but as proof that fermentation had worked. For Victorians, vinegar was less about purity and more about persistence. If food looked and tasted strong, it was considered safe. Children grew used to the contradictions. They learned to eat vegetables that made their eyes water and their throats sting. They asked no questions when adults reassured them that the sourness was a sign of goodness. Over time, the association grew permanent. To them, vinegar was the taste of preservation, of safety, of winter meals when nothing else survived. Compared to modern life, the Victorian reliance on vinegar is startling. Today, pickles are treats or side dishes, chosen for preference rather than survival. In Victorian kitchens, they were lifelines. A jar of vinegar-soaked cucumbers was not a snack but proof that the family had planned ahead. Without such jars, winter meals became monotonous or dangerously thin. Preservation mattered more than pleasure, and vinegar delivered that preservation with brutal efficiency. The contradictions of vinegar reflected broader contradictions in Victorian society. A culture that valued restraint and morality relied on jars of food floating in cloudy, sour liquid. Families displayed these jars proudly, even though they often smelled of rot disguised by acid. Appearances mattered less than endurance. To endure was to survive, and vinegar gave them that endurance. Looking back, vinegar stands as another reminder of how fragile daily life was. It offered food that lasted, but it also reshaped tastes, convincing generations that harshness was normal. The sting of vinegar was a signal of safety, even if that safety was only imagined. People embraced it because it was better than hunger, and hunger was the greater enemy. Vinegar preserved vegetables long enough to fill the gaps between harvests, but it came at the cost of harsh flavours and uneasy health. Families accepted this trade because there was no alternative. Still, they sought other methods, searching for ways to extend food's life without drowning it in acid. Those searches led them toward dairy, where butter and cheese aged into something pungent yet strangely prized. Vinegar gave security at the table, its sting both feared and welcomed. It masked decay while convincing families that food could last. Yet even as it served its purpose, people looked for gentler solutions, turning to milk transformed into butter and cheese, where preservation came with mould, odour, and its own peculiar risks. Butter and cheese in Victorian life occupied a strange position. They were both staples and luxuries, consumed daily yet also displayed with pride at markets and tables. What modern people would recoil from? Rancid butter, mould-covered cheese, pungent smells that filled entire rooms, was often celebrated as a mark of quality. Preservation shaped this perception. Without refrigeration, butter quickly turned, and cheese ripened into forms that looked far from fresh. Instead of rejecting these changes, Victorians learned to embrace them, folding the taste of rot into their idea of richness. At markets, the sight was unavoidable. Wheels of cheese sat stacked, their rinds cracked and spotted with growths of green or blue. Butter, churned weeks earlier, had already taken on a stronger scent, sometimes leaning towards sour. Vendors did not hide these qualities, they advertised them. A cheese with a sharp smell drew customers, not warnings. Buyers leaned close, inhaling the heavy odours as signs of authenticity. To them, a quiet cheese was suspicious, but one alive with smell and colour was desirable. In working-class homes, butter was stretched thin. A small pat had to serve multiple meals, spread over bread or mixed into porridge. Families accepted its sourness as normal, sometimes even mixing herbs or salt to mask the taste as it aged. Cheese, too, was rationed carefully, cut into slivers that flavoured stews or bread. The mould that crept across its surface was scraped off casually, with little thought given to danger. People did not fear mould. They saw it as proof that the cheese was real, that it had aged as intended. Among wealthier households, cheese became a symbol of sophistication. Imported varieties from France or Italy were prized for their strength, their smells filling dining halls. Guests were offered wedges of cheese so pungent they lingered in the air long after plates were cleared. Servants presented butter in decorative moulds, but even these turned quickly in warm rooms. Yet families persisted, because butter and cheese were too valuable to discard. To waste them was unthinkable, and so even the wealthy accepted what modern diners would call spoilage. The cultural shift was striking. Preservation failures turned into traditions. What began as a necessity, consuming food that had changed beyond its original state, became habit. People began to believe that mould added depth, that smell was richness, that sharpness was quality. Children grew up eating cheese with edges flecked by growths of colour, their palates shaped around flavours that today would be discarded. To them, this was not decay, it was culture, and it carried status. Doctors occasionally raised concerns. They noted that butter gone rancid or cheese crawling with life could cause sickness. Yet such warnings carried little weight. The popularity of these foods overwhelmed caution. Families believed experience mattered more than science. If their parents had eaten it, so could they. And for many, the body seemed to adjust. Illness was often blamed on other causes, never on the food itself. In a society accustomed to risk, mould was the least of their worries. The process of storing butter and cheese was crude. Butter was wrapped in cloth, pressed into earthenware pots, and buried in cellars. Cheese was stacked on shelves, turned occasionally, and left to grow into itself. The smells filled storage rooms, saturating walls and floors. Flies gathered, and sometimes small worms or maggots appeared. Rather than rejecting these as contamination, some people accepted them as natural. A cheese alive with creatures was considered strong, even luxurious. What horrifies today was once an emblem of indulgence. Working-class children often encountered these foods at school or in labour. A piece of bread spread with butter that had already soured, or cheese carried in a pocket until it softened, was common fare. They grew used to scraping off visible mould and eating the rest. For them, food was food, and complaints were few. Hunger silenced questions. They endured the flavours, the smells, and the textures because the alternative was going without. Wealthy families embraced the strangeness more openly. They entertained guests with the elaborate cheese boards, the stronger the better. Imported cheeses were prized for their outrageous odours, and to refuse them was to admit weakness. Eating them was a test of refinement, proof of taste. Butter, though quick to spoil, was still served proudly, often coloured to appear fresher than it was. The illusion of abundance mattered more than the truth of freshness. Comparisons to modern life reveal the extremity of this practice. Today, butter is expected to be pale, smooth, and mild. Cheese is controlled, pasteurised, and regulated. Victorians lived in another reality. Their butter was rarely without tang, their cheese rarely without mould. What would be discarded now was treasured then. To modern eyes, this seems reckless. To them, it was simply the way food was meant to be. The contradictions highlight a larger truth about Victorian survival. Families could not afford to see spoilage as waste. They redefined it as character. Mould became depth. Smell became strength. Sourness became proof. In this way, butter and cheese were not just preserved foods, they were symbols of resilience. They showed how people transformed necessity into culture, how they learned to love what they could not avoid. Butter and cheese carried both pride and peril. They gave meals substance and flavour, but they also carried hidden risks. People accepted these risks because the alternative was hunger or waste. They learned to scrape, to cut, to embrace. And in doing so, they reshaped taste, turning decay into delicacy. Butter and cheese offered security with a price, preserving nourishment while altering it beyond recognition. Families clung to them, proud of what others might call foul. Yet even as they embraced mould and smell, they knew more options were needed. Some turned to ice itself, carving blocks from lakes and storing them like treasure, hoping to capture cold in a world that rarely offered it. Butter and cheese stood as proof that Victorians could accept what others would reject. Treating rot as richness and smell as sophistication, their trust in these foods preserved life. But it also revealed how far they were willing to go to survive. The search for preservation did not stop here. It reached for something colder, rarer, and far more costly, the shimmering blocks of ice that only the wealthy could afford. In the Victorian age, ice was not a common household tool. It was a rare and expensive commodity, something reserved for the wealthy who could afford to harvest, store, and transport it. For most families, food spoiled according to the weather, but for the elite, blocks of frozen water offered a glimpse of control that others could only dream of. Imported from lakes, rivers, or even shipped across oceans, ice became both a practical preservative and a symbol of class. Where the poor relied on salt, smoke, or vinegar, the rich could laugh over chilled dishes and cold drinks, enjoying a privilege that set them apart in a society already divided by wealth. The markets reflected this divide. While ordinary stalls overflowed with salted meats and pickled vegetables, certain vendors catered exclusively to affluent households. They advertised ice delivered from northern lakes, carefully packed in sawdust and straw. The blocks glistened under the sunlight, steaming faintly as they met the warmer air. These stalls drew curious glances from the poor, who rarely had the chance to touch ice, let alone buy it. For them, it was a substance of rumour, described with awe as if it were a jewel rather than frozen water. Inside the kitchens of the wealthy, ice was stored in ice houses, specially built structures designed to hold the cold for months. These stone or brick chambers were dug into the earth, insulated with straw and lined with wood. Servants carried in blocks of ice during winter or after shipments arrived, stacking them carefully so they would last. The food placed inside these chambers could be kept for weeks without spoiling, a miracle in an age when warmth usually meant decay. Butter remained firm, milk stayed fresh, and meat held its colour longer. Ice was preserved and elevated to luxury. At the dining tables of the upper classes, the benefits became spectacles. Guests were served chilled fruits, jellies, or even ice creams, dishes unimaginable to most Victorians. Bowls of fresh strawberries cooled by ice became a sign of wealth and refinement. The novelty was as valuable as the preservation itself. To eat something cold in the heat of summer was to experience power, a power that separated the privileged from the rest. While factory workers sweated in cramped kitchens, aristocrats marvelled at frozen desserts, their laughter tinged with superiority. The poor, by contrast, relied on rumour. Children whispered stories about the cold stones that rich families kept in their houses, describing them as magical objects. Labourers might glimpse carts carrying blocks wrapped in straw, watching as water dripped steadily from the edges. The sight confirmed the gap between classes. Ice was not food, yet it became a marker of who had access to comfort and who did not. It was another reminder that even in preservation, inequality ruled Victorian life. The cost of ice was staggering. Harvesting required manpower, storage required infrastructure, and transportation consumed time and resources. Only the richest households could sustain the practice. Even then, the luxury was fragile. In warmer seasons, ice melted quickly despite the best efforts, and replenishment was constant. Shipments from abroad sometimes spoiled before arrival. But the very act of obtaining ice reinforced status. It proved that a family could waste resources on something unnecessary, purely for the sake of distinction. The health impact of ice was ambiguous. For the wealthy, it meant safer milk, butter, and meat. Fewer illnesses were traced to spoiled food. For the poor, who lacked such protection, disease continued unchecked. Ice became not only a class marker, but also a subtle divider of survival. Children in wealthy homes drank cold milk, while children in poor homes drank sour milk and endured stomach cramps. Preservation through ice extended lives, even if quietly, and the inequality deepened. Social gatherings made ice an object of display. Aristocratic hosts delighted in presenting chilled wines, cool pastries, and frozen puddings. Guests admired the novelty, remarking on the marvel of cold in a warm dining room. The spectacle was not about taste alone, but about control over nature. Ice symbolized mastery, proof that wealth could bend the seasons to human desire. In this way, ice became more than preservation. It became performance, turning meals into declarations of power. For most Victorians, though, the reality was simpler. Ice was a dream told second-hand, something heard about, but never touched. Food spoiled quickly, meals were planned around immediate consumption, and children grew up without the experience of cold food. To them, preservation remained tied to salt, smoke, and vinegar. The gap was not just in wealth but in daily life itself. Ice remained a foreign substance, as distant as the glittering banquets of the rich. Compared to modern life, the Victorian reliance on ice as a luxury seems almost surreal. Today, freezers hum in nearly every home, and cold storage is a given. In the Victorian world, ice was a treasure transported with difficulty, stored with effort, and flaunted at the table. What we take for granted was once a mark of aristocracy. The contrast reveals how fragile food preservation was, and how much it depended not on innovation for all, but privilege for the few. Looking back, ice tells a story of inequality disguised as progress. It preserved food more effectively than salt or smoke, but only for those who could afford it. It became a tool of separation, turning preservation into another layer of class distinction. The poor relied on methods that altered taste and harmed health, while the wealthy enjoyed food closer to its natural state. Ice was preservation made visible, glistening in blocks that symbolized survival and superiority alike. Ice offered security to the few, marking their meals with freshness, while others endured rot and sourness. It became both a triumph of human ingenuity and a reminder of the gulf between classes. Yet even for the rich, it was not a perfect solution. Ice melted, shipments failed, and the expense was constant. Families still turned to other methods, layering protections to ensure food lasted. Among these methods was one that involved covering jars and pots in fat or wax, sealing food away in a barrier both strange and unsettling. Ice represented both privilege and fragility, a temporary shield against decay that revealed as much about class as it did about preservation. It promised freshness, but demanded wealth, leaving the rest of society to watch from the outside. What followed was a preservation method far more accessible, one that used fat and wax to coat food in heavy layers, locking it away from air while creating strange, unappealing results. Victorian preservation sometimes took forms that look almost absurd today. One of the strangest was the practice of sealing food beneath layers of animal fat or wax. Jars filled with meat, vegetables, or stews were covered with melted fat poured across the top, hardening into a thick lid. Wax was also used, forming a stiff crust that kept out air. To those who relied on this method, it was ingenious. The barrier blocked odours, slowed decay, and made food last weeks longer than it would otherwise. But the result looked grim. A jar of food topped with grease or wax resembled a candle, half alive and half forgotten, waiting for someone to break through its strange surface. Markets sometimes displayed these jars alongside salted and pickled goods. Shoppers tapped on the hard tops of wax, reassured by the dull sound that signalled a good seal. Vendors claimed the food inside was safe, protected from insects and rot. The truth was less certain. Fat could go rancid, wax could crack, and what waited below might be far from fresh. Still, in an era without refrigeration, any method that offered hope was embraced. People trusted appearances, and a sealed jar gave the illusion of control. Inside working-class homes, fat sealed jars sat in dark corners, often forgotten until needed. Mothers stored leftovers beneath layers of lard, planning to bring them out weeks later when food ran short. The sound of a seal breaking, a faint pop that echoed in small kitchens, became part of life. Families approached it with mixed feelings, half eager, half wary. Sometimes the food was edible, tasting strongly of fat but filling hungry stomachs. Other times, the smell on opening was enough to drive them away. They ate what they could, gambling each time on survival. For wealthier families, wax was favoured. It looked cleaner, smoother, and more deliberate. Jars of fruit preserves were topped with discs of wax, gleaming white against the colours of the food below. Servants melted and poured it carefully, smoothing the surface before storing the jars in pantries. When guests visited, the sealed jars were shown with pride. Wax suggested refinement, even though the principle was the same as fat. It was still a crude barrier against air, a wall between freshness and decay. The taste of food preserved in this way was distinctive. Meat under fat carried a heavy greasiness, no matter how it was cooked later. Fruits under wax sometimes tasted flat, dulled by the long storage, yet families endured it. Preservation was not about flavour, but survival. A strange taste was better than an empty plate. In this way, fat and wax reshaped expectations, teaching people to accept odd textures and strange smells as normal. Health concerns were rarely voiced. Doctors spoke occasionally of rancid fat causing sickness, but few listened. Illness was so common in Victorian life that food was rarely blamed directly. Families told themselves that what mattered was the seal, the illusion of safety. If the surface looked intact, the food was considered sound. Trust was placed not in science but in sight and habit. The process itself filled kitchens with heavy smells. Melting lard clung to the air and clothing, leaving a greasy film on the walls. Wax was little better, dripping across counters and hardening in lumps. Children helped pour the mixtures, their fingers sticking to everything they touched. The work was unpleasant, but it was routine. Preservation always came at a cost, whether it was salt, smoke, vinegar, or now fat. The cost was endured because hunger was worse. The jars also became part of the memory. Children grew up hearing the pop of seals, seeing their parents scrape away mould that sometimes crept beneath. They learned to eat food that looked strange but filled them with warmth. To them, the method was ordinary, even if it carried risks. The idea of questioning it seemed foolish. Preservation was survival, and survival meant acceptance. Comparing this practice to modern life makes it seem bizarre. Today, plastic wraps and airtight containers offer clean, easy solutions. In Victorian kitchens, grease and wax were the only tools available. The difference reveals how desperate preservation was, how people used whatever materials they had at hand to fight against time. What looks primitive now was once a necessity. Fat and wax reflected a deeper contradiction in Victorian society. A culture that spoke of progress and refinement filled its kitchens with jars capped by rancid grease. Appearances of order hid the reality of decay. Families showed pride in their preserved food, even as it carried strange smells and uncertain safety. To them, it was proof of cleverness, of endurance, of the will to outlast hunger. The method worked often enough to survive, but it was never perfect. Food spoiled, seals failed, and meals turned dangerous. Yet people kept pouring fat and wax because the alternative was worse. Preservation in any form was better than waste. In this way, even the most unpleasant methods gained respect. They became traditions, passed down through households, until they felt like culture rather than desperation. Fat and wax turned food into objects both hopeful and unsettling, sealed against decay but altered beyond recognition. They gave families another tool in the endless battle against hunger. One more way to stretch meals into the future. Yet even these methods had limits, and people looked for storage that was more stable and less revolting. They found it underground, in cold, dark chambers that became the first refrigerators of their age. Fat and wax gave the Victorians jars that lasted longer, but also taught them to accept strangeness at their tables. The next solution they turned to was hidden beneath their feet, where stone and soil provided a chill that no amount of fat could match. Victorian homes that had the space and means often relied on underground cellars to preserve their food. These dark, damp chambers were the closest thing to refrigeration before electricity, carved beneath houses or outbuildings to harness the natural chill of the earth. Families stored meat, milk, cheese, and vegetables there, hoping that the cooler air would slow decay. For the poor, cellars were often little more than pits dug beneath cramped cottages, musty and filled with the smell of rot. For the wealthy, they were carefully built stone rooms, lined with shelves and doors designed to keep out light. In both cases, the purpose was the same: to stretch the life of food just a little longer. Walking into one of these spaces was an experience. The air was heavy and cool, filled with the scent of damp earth, souring milk, and the faint tang of fermenting vegetables. Shelves groaned with jars of pickles, crocks of butter, and baskets of root crops. Meat hung from hooks, darkening as it dried slowly in the chill. Families descended with baskets, their footsteps echoing on stone floors, their lanterns throwing faint light across the walls. It was a place of both security and unease. Food waited there, hidden from the warmth that destroyed it, but so did rats, insects, and moulds that thrived in the damp. For working-class families, cellars were crude. Floors were often bare soil, and walls leaked moisture. Food was placed in wooden boxes, earthen pots, or simply left on the ground. Rats scurried freely, gnawing at bread or vegetables. Yet the cellar was still better than nothing. A cabbage in the cellar lasted weeks longer than one left in a kitchen. A pot of milk kept overnight in the cool might be drinkable by morning, while milk on the hearth turned sour by dawn. Poor families accepted the dangers because the alternative was hunger. Among the wealthy, the cold cellar was a mark of order and refinement. Estate houses had cellars designed with care, sometimes with vaulted ceilings and stone shelves. Servants carried food down each day, placing items in neat rows. Wine bottles stood beside baskets of apples, crocks of butter, and wheels of cheese. The chill air preserved them long enough to host feasts weeks after harvest. The wealthy could afford to build doors that sealed tightly, keeping pests out. Yet even in these carefully constructed spaces, rot was never far away. The damp crept into everything, and the smell of fermentation lingered no matter how clean the shelves looked. The cellar shaped daily life. Families planned meals based on what was available underground. In winter, root vegetables from the cellar made up most of the diet, boiled into endless stews. In summer, fruits were brought down to slow their spoiling, though many softened quickly in the damp air. Children were sent down to fetch jars or potatoes, their small hands clutching lanterns, their eyes wide at the shadows that stretched along the walls. They learned to listen for the scuttle of rats and to step carefully on slippery stones. The cellar was part of their world, as ordinary as the kitchen above, though far less comforting. The dangers were real. Spoiled food caused stomach cramps and worse, but often people did not realize the source. Vegetables stored too long grew soft and slimy. Meat left hanging in the damp took on a sour odour. Milk curdled in crocks, sometimes sprouting strange films on the surface. Families scraped away mould, cut off spoiled sections, and ate the rest. Hunger demanded it. They told themselves that the food was still safe, that the earth's coolness had done its work. In truth, the cellar preserved food only imperfectly, slowing decay but never stopping it. Doctors and reformers occasionally criticized cellars, pointing to the mould and vermin that filled them. They warned that damp air carried disease and that spoiled food killed as surely as hunger. But families had few alternatives. Without electricity, without reliable ice, the earth was the only ally they had. A bad meal was a risk they accepted because the choice was between risk and the certainty of starvation. Preservation was always a gamble, and the cellar tilted the odds just enough to keep people alive. The cultural meaning of the cellar was as striking as its function. For the poor, it was a place of resignation. Food placed there was not expected to come out unchanged. It was expected to come out altered, softened, or sour, but still edible. For the wealthy, it was a mark of abundance. To descend into a cellar lined with rows of food was to feel secure, to know the household could endure months of scarcity. Yet both groups lived with the same reality. Decay waited in the shadows, and no one escaped it entirely. The cellar also shaped memory. Children who grew up fetching food from its dark shelves carried the smell with them for life. The odour of earth, mould, and fermentation became part of their idea of survival. To them, preservation was not clean or sterile. It was heavy, damp, and full of compromise. Meals carried the taste of that dampness, and they accepted it as normal. Compared to modern refrigeration, the Victorian cellar seems primitive. Today, we expect food to remain crisp, fresh, and safe for weeks. In the 19th century, families hoped only to slow the inevitable. They lived in a world where food was always slipping toward decay, and where preservation meant clinging to that process with whatever tools they had. The cellar was one of the most effective, but it was never perfect. Looking back, the cold cellar reflects the contradictions of Victorian life. A society that boasted of progress and empire still stored food in damp pits. They accepted rats in the walls and mould on their shelves as part of survival. They presented themselves as orderly and moral, but their daily meals were drawn from spaces that smelled of rot. Preservation was not about dignity, but endurance. The cellar gave them that endurance, though it came wrapped in darkness and decay. The cellar gave families the power to stretch food across seasons, but it also forced them to live with smells and risks that no modern household would tolerate. It was both protection and burden, a reminder that every meal carried uncertainty, and yet families clung to it because the alternative was hunger. From the darkness of the cellar came survival, and survival was enough. The cold cellar offered safety wrapped in dampness, keeping hunger away but never erasing danger. It preserved food imperfectly, always tinged with mould and fear. The next solution, however, was not about storage at all. It was about speed. Families learned that the surest way to keep food from spoiling was simply to eat it before it turned, a race against decay that shaped how Victorians thought about every meal. Meals were rarely planned for days ahead, because food spoiled so quickly that families had to eat as soon as they bought it. A joint of meat, a basket of vegetables, or even a jug of milk could turn within hours if left unattended. The pressure to consume food immediately shaped the rhythm of daily life. Families lived with the constant awareness that their provisions were ticking away like silent clocks, each bite representing one less chance for waste. It was not about indulgence or appetite, but urgency, a race against the natural process of decay that hung over every kitchen. Markets bustled with this urgency. Buyers crowded the stalls in the mornings, choosing meat that still glistened, fish that still looked firm, and bread warm enough to prove it was fresh. The goods were carried home quickly, often cooked within the same day. There was no thought of storing them for tomorrow, because tomorrow meant danger. Vendors understood this rhythm, selling aggressively and loudly, knowing their products had to leave the stall before they softened, soured, or grew spots that no one could ignore. In working-class homes, the rule was simple: eat what you had, and eat it now. Meals were built from what was purchased that morning, and leftovers were rare. If something remained after supper, it was often reheated the following day until its flavour was unrecognisable, simply to make it safe enough to swallow. Children grew used to scraping plates clean not only because of hunger, but because wasting food meant gambling with illness. Their mothers scolded them if they left so much as a crust, knowing that by tomorrow it might be inedible. The wealthy experienced the same urgency, though with more resources to soften the effect. Their kitchens bustled with servants who prepared multiple meals a day, each one relying on fresh deliveries from butchers, bakers, and grocers. Even in great houses with cellars and ice, the knowledge remained food was fleeting. Lavish dinners had to be timed carefully, with courses prepared in rapid succession so that meat, fish, and sauces arrived at the table before turning. Guests might marvel at abundance, but behind the scenes, the fear of spoilage drove every decision. This urgency shaped culture. Meals were not leisurely affairs stretched across time, but punctual events tied to the limits of preservation. People ate when food was ready, not when it was convenient. Breakfast, lunch, and supper were dictated not by the clock but by the pace of decay. The rhythm of families revolved around this truth, their lives punctuated by the need to consume before nature reclaimed what they had purchased. The risks of waiting were clear. Milk left too long curdled into foul lumps. Meat forgotten in a corner turned green and released odours that filled entire rooms. Bread hardened quickly, then grew mould, its surface spotted with colours no one wished to taste. Vegetables wilted, potatoes sprouted, and fruit collapsed into mush. Families recognised these signs and learned to act before they appeared. To eat quickly was not greed but wisdom, a defence against the invisible armies of decay. Doctors often treated cases of food poisoning without naming them as such. Families fell ill after meals, their stomachs cramping, their bodies weakened. Yet many blamed general weakness or fate rather than the obvious truth. They knew food spoiled but chose not to dwell on it, because acknowledging the danger meant admitting how fragile survival was. It was easier to keep eating quickly, to keep moving forward, than to pause and wonder what unseen forces lingered on their plates. Children grew up with this lesson ingrained. They learned to eat even when not hungry, because the food would not wait. They were told to finish their portions, to swallow quickly, to treat every meal as fleeting. The joy of eating was often lost in this urgency, replaced by the quiet anxiety of knowing that tomorrow's plate might not be safe. Over time, the habit became a culture, and culture became a tradition. Comparing this practice to modern life highlights the severity of the Victorian condition. Today, refrigerators allow families to store food for weeks without fear. Leftovers can be wrapped, chilled, and enjoyed later. In the 19th century, such comfort was impossible. To delay eating was to gamble with health. The pressure to consume quickly shaped not only meals but attitudes toward food itself. Waste was rare, not because of virtue, but because nature allowed no other choice. The rule of eat quickly or spoil also revealed the divide between classes. The wealthy could afford replacements if food turned, discarding a dish without financial ruin. The poor had no such luxury. They ate whatever remained, no matter how altered, trusting spices or vinegar to disguise what time had done. Their resilience was born of desperation, their stomachs hardened by necessity. To them, the slogan was not a suggestion but a command that governed survival. This constant race against spoilage also changed how people remembered meals. They did not recall leisurely evenings of leftovers or slow enjoyment. They remembered hurried suppers, scraping bowls clean, and the relief of empty plates. The taste of urgency lingered long after the food was gone. Families celebrated when food lasted long enough to be eaten safely, a small victory against decay. Yet the victories were always temporary, and the battle began again with each trip to the market. The cellar, salt, smoke, and vinegar, each bought families time, but never enough. The reality remained that food had to be consumed at speed. This urgency gave preservation its most direct form not a technique, but a habit. It became the invisible rule of Victorian life, shaping diets, routines, and even memories. Every meal carried with it the whisper of time slipping away. Food in Victorian times was less about savouring than surviving, less about pleasure than urgency. Families lived with the knowledge that what was fresh now would be dangerous tomorrow. Eating quickly became their safeguard, their rhythm, their way of life. But even this was not enough, and people sought new solutions, ones that promised both